Hello, and welcome to the training on pre-authorization and the administrative peer review process. My name is Charles Carpenter. I am the Program Manager for the Medical Resource Office here at the Industrial Commission of Arizona. This is the second training of two that are provided by the Medical Resource Office. The first training is on the treatment guidelines, and you should have already taken that training. As such, you'll know that pre-authorization and administrative peer review are both part of the treatment guidelines. That is, the treatment guidelines outline the treatment or services that injured workers should receive in the state of Arizona as part of their benefit. It's really important that they receive their benefits. It's important that they receive care that's reasonably required. And so the treatment is going to detail establishing what that treatment is and helping you or giving you, the claim adjuster, a resource that you can utilize when determining if care is reasonably required. Today we're going to go into the pre-authorization process. I'm going to really dig into the form. I'm going to outline what parts of the form you're responsible for, what you should look for from the healthcare provider, or in some cases the injured worker. I'll talk about the timelines with the pre-authorization form. Very important that you and everyone in your office understands those timelines. It's just one of those things where we've seen some issues because of timelines, and understanding them is one of the most important things when it comes to the pre-authorization process. I'll talk about the documentation, both the documentation expectations for the healthcare providers, what you should be looking for, as well as the documentation expectations for you as the claims adjuster when you're looking at or determining to approve or deny pre-authorizations. I'll talk about the administrative peer review process, what you need to know in terms of who performs it, the documentation expectations, what you're going to receive, and finally, I'll tie up this training with disputes. In other words, I'll go into what you as a claims adjuster can do if you want to dispute the findings in a peer review. I'll also talk about the options for other parties as well. So in the state of Arizona and in accordance with the treatment guidelines, pre-authorization is not required. There are some exceptions. If you'll go to the fee schedule guidelines, for example, injections, after an initial set of 10, the providers are required based on the guidelines to pre-authorize the next set of 10. There may be some instances for providers who are providing physical medicine rehabilitation services to pre-authorize, but for the most part, pre-authorization is not required unless there's an exception in the treatment, unless there's an exception in the fee schedule, in the guidelines to the fee schedule. So it's not required, just letting you know that. You may see some pre-authorization requests for treatment or services that are normally considered evidence-based. For example, physical therapy. It's evidence-based, it's presumed correct, but you may see pre-authorization requests for that. The reason being is because healthcare providers, a lot of them are providing services to multiple payers, if you will, to commercial payers, to Medicare. And a lot of times those same services or the treatment or services, they may be required to pre-authorize before performing those specific treatment or services. So just letting you know, in the workers' compensation system, unless otherwise specified in the fee schedule and the guidelines to the fee schedule, pre-authorization is not required. So while it's not required, pre-authorization, a lot of providers like to go the route of pre-authorization to ensure that the treatment or services are considered or presumed correct or considered correct, considered reasonable, if you will, and will be reimbursed. This is what the pre-authorization form looks like. Please make sure that everyone in your office knows what this form looks like. If you receive a fax and it has this form on it, if you receive it by email or by mail, again, it's an action item. Please make sure everyone in your office knows about it. Make sure that they know they need to get it to the correct individual who is managing that claim. The injured worker's information is included on this form. Make sure it gets to the right person. This is the pre-authorization form. This is section 1. Section 1 is completed by the healthcare provider. We talk to healthcare providers as well. We let them know, or we inform them, we train them that when they complete section 1, it needs to be completed entirely. It needs to include the diagnosis codes. If you're requesting treatment or services, you need to indicate the CPT codes for that specific treatment or service. You need to have the patient's information in there. All of that information needs to be there. Additionally, the healthcare provider must submit documentation that substantiate or supports the treatment or services that are being requested. So if they're going to request additional physical therapy treatment, they need to provide with documentation that supports that treatment. If they're going to be asking for other services, again, the documentation has to support the reasonableness for that treatment or service. After you receive a Section 1 request, you need to respond to that Section 1 request in Section 2. So this is where you as the claims adjuster or you as the payer need to be responsive. If you receive a Section 1 request from a healthcare provider, you have 7 business days to respond. When you respond, you need to indicate in this line right here whether you intend or whether you approve the treatment or services, whether you partially deny or whether you deny the treatment or services that are requested in the Section 1 request. You also can indicate, or you can return this to the healthcare provider indicating that the request for pre-authorization is incomplete. Let's say they didn't include their notes. They didn't put in the CPT codes or the ICD, the diagnostic codes. If that Section 1 request is incomplete, again, you can send it back indicating that it's incomplete, but it must be done within 7 business days. Also, if you choose to pursue an independent medical exam to support your decision on the treatment or services, or if you've already requested one anyways because it's a complicated case or whatever the reason may be, you can indicate in that same line that an IME is being requested. In cases where an IME is requested, the timeline is paused. Okay? What happens is you're going to send that injured worker to the IME. After you get the IME report, you need to send a copy of the report to the healthcare provider who sent in the Section 1 request. Then you have 7 business days to determine or to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to approve, partially deny, or deny the treatment or services that are requested in that Section 1 request. If you deny or partially deny treatment or services in a Section 1 request, you also must send that partial denial or denial to the injured worker and their legal representative if they have one. So please don't forget that part of it. If you're denying treatment or services, a couple of guidelines, or there's a couple of rules within the treatment guidelines that you need to be aware of first. You should not be denying care or requests for treatment or services solely because the guidelines don't address that specific treatment or service. So again, if it's not addressed, that's not a reason, if you will, to deny care. Additionally, if you want to deny care, treatment, or services that's being requested that is supported by ODG, in other words, it's presumed to be reasonable, presumed to be correct or evidence-based, then you need to rebut that presumption with a medical opinion or a psychological opinion. So make sure that you have that documentation if you're going to deny care, deny treatment or services requested that are supported by ODG. Again, if you deny the request, make sure that it goes to the injured worker or their legal representative as well. Make sure that you get it back to that provider, the Section 1 request, within 7 business days. Okay, so let's just move on as if, number 1, an IME was not used. Once an IME is utilized in the pre-authorization process, the entire process is done. If you approve a Section 1 request in Section 2, then it's done. So we're going to move forward as if treatment or services requested in Section 1 were denied or partially denied. If that's the case, then either the healthcare provider or the injured worker or their legal representative can complete a Section 3 request. So again, partial denial or denial that's not supported by an independent medical exam, you may see a Section 3 reconsideration request. It has to be completed entirely. It also needs to include the documentation that addresses the reason for the denial in the Section 1 request. So that's why it's so important to indicate your reason for the denial, because if you get a Section 3, they need to address that reason, and they need to provide you with the documentation that supports that request. You as the claims adjuster, as the payer, are going to respond with Section 4. Throughout this entire process, you're going to look at each section. You're going to respond based on the provider's best information or their appropriate means of communication. And in Section 4, you're going to indicate in this section whether or not you're going to approve, partially deny, or deny, completely deny that Section 3 request. You can also indicate if you're going to pursue an IME or an independent medical exam at this time. Please make sure that if you deny or partially deny a Section 3 reconsideration request, that you send a copy to the employee and the employee's attorney. So the timeline for a Section 3 reconsideration request is exactly the same as Section 1. So the thing you have to remember with this pre-authorization form, regardless of Section 1 or Section 3, is you have 7 business days to respond. You have 7 business days to either approve, partially deny, or indicate that you're going to pursue an IME. Again, same rules apply. If you pursue an IME, the entire process is on pause. You can get that report back. You send a copy of the report to the injured worker or their legal representative if they sent in that Section 3 request. You send a copy of the report to the healthcare provider if they sent in the Section 3 request. Then you have 7 business days to decide as to whether or not you're going to approve, partially deny, or deny the treatment or services, again, based on that IME. If you utilize an IME at any point in the process or the pre-authorization process, it's done. The only way that it can be disputed is through a 1061J process, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So if you utilize an IME, it's done. If you approve a Section 3 request, it's done. However, we're going to talk about, what can happen if you partially deny or deny that Section 3 reconsideration request. So potential at this part or at this point is that the provider or the injured worker can request or can send in a request or a Section 5 request for a peer review. That is the only time that this documentation needs to go to the commission. All of the Section 1, 2, 3, 4 communication happens between the healthcare provider or the injured worker and the payer. Section 5 goes to the commission, and we're at the point where we'll talk about the criteria to be eligible for an administrative peer review. So the first one is if the payer fails to respond to a Section 1 request from a healthcare provider within 7 business days. That's why I emphasize these timelines so much. Make sure you're responding and you're responsive to these forms. We have seen multiple Section 5 peer review requests simply based on the fact that the payer did not respond within 7 business days. We have sent these on to peer review. It's gone through the entire process, and a couple of days later the adjuster calls us and say, hey, I would have approved that treatment. Well, great, but if they don't know within 7 business days, they can still request a peer review. Additionally, like I said, sometimes you'll get requests or pre-authorization requests for treatment or services that are considered reasonable or are presumed to be correct. In that case, if you don't respond, it could still go to peer review. The providers, again, they're following process or procedures in other systems, or they just want to make sure they're going to be reimbursed. So if you fail to respond to a Section 1 request, it can go to peer review. If you fail to respond to a Section 3 reconsideration request within 7 business days, it can go on to an administrative peer review. If you deny treatment or services that are supported by ODG in a Section 1 request, that can automatically be sent on to peer review. Again, you need to have the reason or a medical or psychological opinion that rebuts the presumption, but even if you do, it can go to peer review. If you deny treatment or services by a healthcare provider or the injured worker in a Section 3 reconsideration request, it is eligible for peer review. And again, the big thing in all of these is that an IME report was not used as the basis for any denial at any point. So again, when we talk about the pre-authorization process, it can continue through each step to get to peer review. If there's no response, it can go to peer review. If it's denied and it's supported by ODG, it can go to peer review. If it's denied and it's gone through Section 1 and 3 through the initial approval process, through the reconsideration process, the provider has given documentation that supports the clinical rationale behind it, then it can go to peer review, but it cannot go to peer review if an IME is utilized as the basis for that. So let's talk about the administrative peer review. When it goes to an administrative peer review, you're going to see a document that indicates the decision from that administrative peer review. Number one, it's going to indicate whether the request for treatment or services is authorized or denied in whole or in part. In other words, if you denied it, they'll either approve or go along with the denial, or they will overturn that denial. It's going to indicate the information that the individual who performed the peer review looked at, the information they reviewed. It's going to indicate the principal reason for their decision, and finally, it's going to have the clinical basis and the rationale for that decision. This is what an administrative peer review looks like. I know this paper is highly redacted. We do need to protect the information of that person, but I do want to demonstrate there where that red arrow shows. In this case, the denial was overturned. The treatment or services were considered to be reasonable and should be part of the benefits. Really quickly, when I talk about the peer review process, we utilize a contractor who supplies or who sends this peer review request onto the individuals who perform the peer review. The contractor is URAC accredited, and furthermore, this contractor does not have any contracts with insurance companies. So we can assure that the entire process is very objective and that there's no partiality. The individual who performs that peer review is licensed or certified to practice within their specialty or within whatever licensing they should have or whatever certification they should have. They must have practiced within the previous 5 years, so they do have clinical experience, and additionally they must be in the same specialty or subspecialty that normally performs that treatment or services. So these are highly qualified individuals. They're going to reach out to the healthcare provider and talk about this case. At times they reach the provider, at times they don't. But they make an honest effort to make the best determination for that injured worker. And like I said, it's very objective. There's no partiality. What they're doing is they're looking at whether or not the treatment or services that were requested should be considered reasonable and should be part of that treatment plan. So if it has gone through a peer review, there is still a process for disputing a peer review. The first thing you need to know about this process is that it has to be initiated by an interested party. Interested parties in the state of Arizona include the injured worker, the employer's insurance company, and finally the commission. So in Arizona, healthcare providers are not considered interested parties, and as such, they cannot initiate a 1061 or a dispute of a peer review. However, you as the payer You can dispute a peer review. Let's say they overturn the denial, but you know they should not do that. You can dispute it by filing with the Commission's Administrative Law Judge Division for hearing. In other words, you're going to complete a 1061J. It has to be in writing. It has to be filed no later than 10 business days after the administrative peer review determination is received. And finally, you're going to indicate whether or not you want to participate in the Fast Track ALJ Dispute Resolution Program. So if you get a decision for a peer review, you do have the option to dispute it. You can go to the Administrative Law Judge Division on the Industrial Commission of Arizona's webpage. You can find out how to file that, and there are resources that help you understand what you need to put in when you file for a 1061J. Additionally, the injured worker, let's say a denial is upheld, the injured worker can file a dispute as well. They can file a 1061J. They can provide the documentation indicating why that treatment or service is necessary. So interested parties can file a dispute and can dispute that peer review. So the big things to remember about pre-authorization and peer review. Number one, please respond within 7 business days. Number two, make sure that you have your documentation. And finally, if you deny or partially deny, send that copy to the injured worker or their legal representative. And if it goes to, if the injured worker or the healthcare provider submit to the medical resource office, we will reach out to the payer. You have 2 business days to respond to us. Please let us know, especially if you're pursuing an IME, if it's going to be approved, if you're going to deny, what your disposition on that case is. We will reach out before we pursue a peer review. Well, the last thing to know about peer reviews is that it is paid for by the insurance company or by the payer. So please make sure you respond, make sure you're on top of that form. If you have any questions, my name is Charles Carpenter. I'm at the Medical Resource Office. Our information is here, and thank you for attending this training. Let us know if you have any questions or any additional training needs, and we're happy to work with you. Have a great day.